guys, so that was the second violin to Handel's Hornpipe from Water Music. The hardest thing about this piece is going to be playing with the right style. I also went ahead and changed bowings to make sure that that style is somewhat more achievable. And then I also put in little dynamic phrases just so you can feel that, like for instance, if you look at measure 7, 6, 22, 23, you see these crescendos pretty much throughout the piece. Those crescendos are on any repeated notes because you generally want repeated notes to feel the motion going forward. So, again, the hardest thing is to play with the right style, so knowing what part of the bow we should be playing in. If you notice, for quarter notes, for half notes, dotted half notes, I tend to use my whole bow. But anything that's going to be shorter than a quarter note, we generally want to be in the lower half. The style that we're trying to aim for is more of a martelet stroke. Martelet literally means hammer-like. So when we play, we have to have almost a percussive sound to our instrument. So everything is very clear and articulate. No slurs, nothing legato, but we want to make sure that everything is very crisp. So to achieve that, you have to have a good bow hand, and you have to have a strong first finger so that you can really pull the sound out at the beginning of each note so it has a good attack. Especially when we get to fast notes like eighth notes. So at the beginning, try and use a full sound, so plenty of bow, but make sure we have a good martelet sound, not legato. So there should be space between the notes. So from the beginning, you'll have, right? And then when you get to that eighth note at measure 2, make sure you have plenty of up bow so that you can land that quarter note at the frog and where you can really be strong. One of the characteristics of a hornpipe is that we're kind of emphasizing the ands of the beat. So here, if you look at measure 2, that D falls on the and, or the and of the first beat. Same thing for measure 3, the A falls on the and, or the quarter note A at measure 4 also falls on the and of beat 1. So that's why following these bowings is also very important because it's going to kind of lead you, and the down bows are also going to have more of an accent and it's going to be stronger. So again, just try and make sure you find yourself in the lower half of the bow. Also, you're going to probably need to practice the bowings so that you feel comfortable. I would do things on open strings, so starting from measure 1, you can think 1, 2, 3. And then try and work on that same attack, making sure everything falls in this lower half of the bow. And then after you get it on the open string, then you can start adding fingers to it. Right? Now when you get to measure 5, this is the beginning of those crescendos. Notice you don't have always the repeated phrase or markings, but we do feel that it needs to go to the downbeat of the next measure. So as you do the last eighth notes of measure 5, you should feel those eighth notes moving into measure 6, just like the eighth notes in measure 6 need to move into measure 7, so on and so on. So make sure you feel that inflection going forward. So these are the eighth notes at the end of measure 5. Now, the other thing is we have to do the dynamic contrast. So if you see measure 5, we are actually at a piano level. And then as you move to measure 7, we have a forte level. We're still in the same part of the bow, so the lower half. The only way you're going to achieve that dynamic contrast is by giving more weight. So we're not going to use more bow, which is one way that you can get louder, but then if we use more bow, it tends to get very sloppy. So this is measure 5, the eighth notes at the end, with the incorrect way. Sorry, piano. can get kind of sloppy and not as articulate. So keep things controlled, and when you see those fortes, don't give me more bow, just give me more weight. Okay, so stylistically, like I said, this is the hardest thing to do, is being true to the style. Measure 15 is very similar to the beginning, and then 19 is very similar to what we had at measure 7 and 8. Now, with measure 7 and 8, I would highly recommend using a fourth finger on the first A. It's kind of silly to do a bunch of open strings, especially on repeated notes. So like at measure 8, you see all these A's. Generally, you want to stick your fourth finger on those A's, and then you can add a little bit more vibrato. Plus, the open A tends to have a very ringing sound, or a ringing timbre. We want to try and eliminate that and blend it in with everybody else in the orchestra. So, try and use your fourth finger, especially here. I would try and use your fourth finger on the first 16th note, because it is a little cumbersome to do open A, then G, and then using your fourth finger. So you can make it work, but it's a little bit easier if you use your fourth finger to begin with. So that's something to consider. And it happens later on at measure 19, same thing. Right? When you get to 22, again, these eighth notes need to move forward. Then when we get to measure 25, that's the first time we get to our dotted quarter notes. And I'm sure your teachers have taught you about dotted quarter notes and what dots do on notes. So whenever the dot is on the side of the note, that means you must extend the note by half of its value. So in this case, we have a quarter note with a dot. So a quarter note in 3/4 time means it should get one beat. So if it's one beat with a dot, that means you're going to add half of one, which is a half. So dotted quarter notes would get 1.5 beats. For instance, if you look at measure 61, we have dotted half notes. Dotted half notes, well, a half note gets 2 beats. So half of 2 is 1. So 2 plus 1 is 3. So that's basically how your dots are going to work. Here at measure 25, we're going to make sure we play that 1.5 beats, but then we're going to hook in the eighth note to follow. Sorry, I just noticed I forgot to hit record on the good microphones. So you're going to have just whatever sound comes off the videotape, but from this moment on, you're going to have better sound. So what I was saying is those dotted quarter notes need to hook into the eighth notes to follow. So in order to achieve that, you have to probably practice these with separate from the music, and you practice it like on a scale. And then you might be asking, well, why do we have to hook it? Well, if we don't hook in the eighth note to follow the dotted quarter note, then we start to get things what I call like a musical fart, where we do things inappropriately, or it just kind of shoots out, and it kind of catches people off guard. So measure 25, if I play that up bow, the eighth note to follow, if I played it as an up bow, it would stick out. And then you probably don't notice it as much when I play it, but if you have a whole orchestra and you have like 40 violins playing that up bow, it definitely will stick out. So that's why we want to hook those in. Right? So practice it with a scale. and then repeat the notes as you do it. And then I would also do it without repeating the notes, so just go consecutively one after the other. And then when you get comfortable with that, then you can move through measure 25. And then the only thing I can say is when you do your hook, make sure you give a good amount of weight to that first finger so that you can pull that eighth note and that it sounds like a true beginning of a note. When you get to 29, again, that's very similar to measure 7 and 8. Right? As you do that little section there, you might have to work out the string crossings. When you get to the B for measure 31, I would really only take the fingers that's necessary. So if you're on the D string, feel that third finger stay down and only take the second finger across. Because if you have to hop all the fingers over, it'll slow you down. So try and only take the necessary fingers. So 29 again. Right. And then that same kind of hook pattern happens at measure 33 and 34 with the dotted quarter notes. You may say, well, 33 I see a dotted quarter note, but I don't see a second dotted quarter note. If you notice the quarter notes tied across from 33 to 34, the last quarter note there, so you want to feel that is essentially the same feeling as the dotted quarter note. And then when you have just your separate quarter notes, make sure that we place space in there. It's not to be played legato. That's the wrong style. Right. And it's also the end of the phrase, so you should probably taper it a little bit, but we'll talk more about that stuff in our first rehearsal. Measure 35 is very similar to what we had before at 29. When you get to measure 39, it's a dotted half note, but you also need to retake your bow and get into measure 40. So you will count 1, 2, 3, but as soon as you get to that third beat, we're pretty much going to lift and be ready for the downbeat at measure 40. Now 40 to the rest of the page, it's not as challenging as the first half, but you have to retake your bow quite a bit so that you're always in the right part, which we talked about in the lower half. So you're getting that good marche-allais and articulate sound. And then also you want to make sure that you observe the dynamics, and we look at some of these accidentals, especially like the D sharp at measure 42. So when you have that D sharp, you can play it with a low one, which is what I prefer, and you can also play it with a high 4. But the high 4 may not be the most viable option in this case because we're not going to the G string at all. So let's keep it on the D string and keep it really clean and clear. In order to make that clean and clear, you have to be accurate with your shift. We don't want to hear the slide. So make sure you put space between your eighth notes. Not good marche-allais. And then in between the spaces when you make your slide so that we don't hear the slide. So measure 40. Now, the other thing that's very hard about this is not to do such ginormous retakes so that your bow is very small, or the retakes are very small and they're concise. Also, always start from the string. Oftentimes I'll see kids do things like this. Right, and where the bow falls down on the string. make sure you always set and then you go. Set, set, set. Right, with the right notes, of course. But that's what I'm saying is like just making sure it's nice and clean, very clear, and accurate. Those kinds of things, that's what's going to get you ahead with your auditions. So you can work on that. That's I might have underestimated the second half because those bow lists are rather tricky. So be careful about how we're placing the bow. And that's definitely something that we'll work on in our first rehearsal. It pretty much plays itself out the rest of the page. We have that same dotted quarter note hook at measure 51, still those D sharps, and then at measure 54 we get to those G sharps. So when you see G sharp, really the only way you can raise a G is by playing a low 1. So same kind of concept here, make sure it's good for the whole measure. So measure 53. Getting a beautiful tone when you play. And then we get to the end here at measure 59. Of course, you're going to count your rests. Pardon me, I'm trying to get through all these videos rather quickly, so I kind of skipped the rests at measure 12 through 14. I only gave you one measure instead of 3. And in this case, measure 57, make sure you count your 2 beats of rest, 58, 3 beats of rest, 59, 1.5, and you come in on the and of 2. I'm sorry, that's a G. Now, as you play that open G, you can't really do a lot musically, but I'm going to teach you what false vibrato is. So false vibrato is when you play an open string, and we generally use it on G strings quite a bit, because your D string, your A string, your E string, you can always vibrate one string lower with your 4th finger. But you can't do that on the G string, seeing how it's the last string. So to do a false vibrato, oftentimes what you do is you do an octave higher. So in this case you have a G, so I'm going to place a G on the D string. And then from that G, I can add vibrato but still play the open G. By vibrating on the D string and playing the open G, you're adding vibrations to your instrument. You kind of are moving it in a sense, and it gives it that same sort of feel as just a normal vibrato. So from that point we get to the DC al fine. DC means da capo, so you go back to the top of the piece, and then al fine means to end at the fine marking, which is measure 39. Basically you play it straight through the same way. The only thing that's different is when you get to measure 38 we have the rit 2x. Rit is short for ritardando, and 2x means second time. So the second time you play it through, after the DC, the second time you play it through, and once you get to measure 38, we're going to start to slow it down. So gradually slow it down, because that's the definition of ritardando. So I'll play it from measure 35, the end of 35, into 36, all the way to the fine. And you can hear how it slows down, right? So, again, don't practice straight through with the video. I would stop and start, pause, make sure you remember where you are whenever you have to leave your instrument and come back to this video. That way you can kind of work your way through and you can try and work on all these little details. And then, just make sure that the details in any sort of music is what basically propels you forward and gives you more of an advantage. So the more details you can put into your piece, the better it's going to be. So happy practicing and good luck.